My name is Fred. I'm with Abraj, and we're delighted to have with us today Tom Fletcher. You saw it in the invitation. I think a lot of you already know Tom Fletcher. I sort of heard that some of you also coming from Lebanon, so you probably saw him up and close and in action. Tom was for 4 or 5 years the ambassador of the UK in Lebanon. He's also been involved in other parts of the world, Northern Ireland, Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. But I think he's mostly known to all of us as the naked diplomat. I am going to ask you to please explain to us what you mean by that or what that means. But some of you may also have referred or come across Tom when he wrote his famous letter, his goodbye letter to Lebanon. It's a letter. I'm actually going to read for you the beginning of it, because for those of you who haven't read it, just see how he starts off the letter by describing a little bit his postings in Lebanon. So it goes like this: bullets and buttocks, dictators and divas, warlords and wasta, Machiavellis and mafia, guns, greed and God, Game of Thrones with RPGs, human rights and hummus rights, 4 marathons, 100 blogs, 10,000 tweets, 59 calls on prime ministers, 600 plus long dinners. You did 52 graduation speeches, yeah. 2 One Lebanon rock concerts. You counted 43 additional gray hairs. Yep. A job swap with a domestic worker, a walk the length of the coast. You got to fly a Red Arrow upside down, and a fly over Lebanon's northern border to see how the Lebanese Air Force is enforcing sovereignty in their airspace. And you were even offered a free buttock lift, but because its value exceeded the 140-pound gift limit, that daunting task still remains undone. Yeah. Were you sort of grateful or offended when that offer was made?
I was surprised, really. I mean, there's nothing in the diplomatic rule book about how you should respond to an offer of a free buttock lift. I wondered whether I could just have one done, but that was, again, out of the question. It was just, I think it was meant generously, but I did feel a bit perturbed. Right.
So, Tom, I mean, the subject matter here is technology, the impact of technology on 21st century diplomacy. How do diplomats today, what do they need to understand about this technology, lest that they fall into irrelevance, complete irrelevance, right? So talk to us a little bit about your experience in Lebanon, about your thoughts on the advent of technology and diplomacy.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, and thank you to all of you for coming out this morning to hear a recovering diplomat, a recovering ambassador, and it would be great to get into an open discussion about what's on your minds. I think, in a way, I'll start with the idea of the naked diplomat. I think the first ever diplomat was not Talleyrand or Kissinger or any of the other great names that we know in diplomatic history, but it was actually a prehistoric man. And we don't know who he was. We don't know what he looked like, but let's call him Ugg for the sake of argument. And Ugg was the first guy who decided that he would have more effect, more impact, if he persuaded some other prehistoric men to stop clubbing each other over the head and go and hunt together. So he was the first guy to prioritize that basic human instinct around collaboration over the basic human instinct around conflict, in order to maximize resource. So he was almost certainly, literally, a naked diplomat. And one of the things that I was trying to do in Lebanon was to get us back to that raw essence of diplomacy, which is around connecting people, connecting with people, without all of the paraphernalia that we've built around our business since then. The idea that we should dance around calling ourselves Your Excellency, that we should produce these statements that are just full of platitudes and which turn people off. People don't feel they can connect with what we're talking about because we talk about being gravely concerned about this change in bilateral relations between Britain and, it's dire stuff that turns people off immediately. So what I was trying to do was to reconnect with that basic essence of diplomacy. But to do that, as Fred says, a large part of it is now about technology. We have in our pockets this smartphone superpower that not just diplomats, but no one ever had before, and that allows us to connect with people in enormously transformational ways. And we all know what the smartphone and digital technology will do to power. And we're going to go through, people say, a century of change equivalent to the last 43 centuries of change, like going from cave paintings to the atom bomb in a lifetime. And that will put many big ideas out of business, many businesses out of business, many states out of business, and that will create many winners. Some of you may be the winners already, but it will also create a huge number of losers. And so my business of diplomacy has got to be about trying to make that transition safer, more stable, because we all know that when we've gone through transitions like that in the past, we've had huge, huge conflict. And to do that, we diplomats are also going to have to use this smartphone superpower. One other brief story from diplomatic history is this fantastic guy called Shen, who was a Chinese diplomat 8,000 years ago. And his job, he was the Sherpa. He was there to do the negotiations after his emperor had won the wars. His emperor was an extraordinarily effective emperor, but when he won the battle, he would bury half the army up to their necks in sand, which is a pretty strong negotiating tactic. If you want to kind of win a negotiation and your opponent is buried up to his neck in sand, you're probably halfway there already. So Shen's job was quite easy as a diplomat, as an ambassador. But on the way to one of these negotiations, he failed to realize that his opponents in the negotiation had developed a way of traveling faster by resting horses along the way, which meant that a 5-day journey you could do in 3 days because you had fresh horses. So Shen turned up late. As a result, he messed up the negotiation. He had to go back to his emperor, who, as you can imagine, is not a very forgiving type, and admit that as a result of this, he'd got a less effective peace deal than he would have got. And his emperor had him slow sliced, death by 1,000 cuts, bit by bit. We only know about this because it was the first ever human rights case in history, and it was written down centuries later by a Chinese lawyer. But the lesson of that is, of course, that in diplomacy, as in other businesses, if you do not adjust to new technology, if you're not out there using digital media to do your job, then you end up getting slow sliced. And as a business, that's what's happening to my craft now. We are getting slow sliced. We are losing out because of lack of economic resource, because people no longer see the point of diplomacy, because people are fed up with the world, they're frightened of the world. You've got people like Donald Trump who think the answer to the 21st century is just to build a bigger wall. So we're up against it as a craft. And what I'm trying to do is to explain to people why diplomacy matters so much, and try to explain to diplomats how we use this new technology to do it better.
So tell us a little bit about decision-making in today's world for diplomacy, because Benjamin Franklin, when he was posted to Paris as the U.S. ambassador, if he wanted to get any kind of information back to the government, it would have taken 6 months or so, right? So I guess in those situations, the diplomat takes decisions, probably to the best of his knowledge, without really referring or being able to refer back to government. Whereas today, and especially you, having lived in a very volatile situation going back and forth with many different factions and political agendas playing right in front of you, how does technology now today complicate or ease diplomatic decision making?
So I really envy Franklin and the diplomats of that generation for the the freedom they would have had. When he went to Paris, by the way, he invented bifocals so that he could read the lips of the French diplomats to understand what they were saying behind the curtain. And there's a letter from Jefferson about the American ambassador in Spain, where he says, "I haven't heard from our ambassador for 3 years. If we do not hear from him again for another 2 years, we should send him a letter." I mean, what a fantastic time to be an ambassador when you could go away for 5 years and just get on with it. And many of my predecessors in Beirut were doing this. Famously in the 1860s, and the Lebanese here will know the story very well about the Brits supporting the Druze in the wars of the civil wars of the 1860s. My predecessor did that without any reference to London. In fact, he was told by London to stop. But by the time the letter arrived, he was able to write back and say, actually, it's too late, the war is over. I armed one faction and they used the arms. It is much, much harder for us now. And I think there's a perception that with every technological change, the role of the man, or increasingly the woman on the spot, has diminished compared to the capital. When Palmerston, a British Foreign Secretary, saw the first telephone that was presented to him, he said, "My God, this is the end of diplomacy." And when people saw the fax machine, they said, right, you can replace the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with a fax. But I would argue you still need people on the ground who have that feel for what's going on. You still need a human in the... You can't replace diplomacy with artificial intelligence and robotics now. But it does mean that we have to fight harder as ambassadors for that influence and for that access and for that value added that London or our capitals can't generate themselves.
But that value add that you talk about and that you talked about earlier, I mean, basically another way I think of saying what you're expounding here is that there's a shift from government to government diplomacy to people diplomacy, right? And that the diplomat has to see himself or herself as part of that people sort of diplomacy movement. So I'd like to read just a short little something and have you comment about it. It's written by a diplomat from a country that will remain unnamed, but he was saying this. So about technology and the impact on diplomacy. It means that if diplomacy is to keep up with the world, it must focus on participating in the myriad of emerging global conversations. The name of the game is relevance. A diplomatic service that is stuck in the mind frame of broadcasting and fails to narrowcast and focus on the wide spectrum of passions, of priorities and identities which make up the contemporary polity will be quick to lose its value. Now, can you refer that to your experience in Lebanon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely right, and it's a product of the decline in traditional sources of authority, including states
And boundaries.
And so anything that is attached to a hierarchy, as diplomacy is, will find itself struggling in a more networked century. So you can see it happening all around us. And so you do have to shift mindsets. And it's actually a much more controversial idea than you'd imagine. So as ambassador in Lebanon, I was Her Majesty's ambassador. I was the ambassador of the Queen to Lebanon. I was part of that tradition where a monarch would send someone they trusted to another country to tell them about the country. And you would, on arrival, present credentials to prove that you were the trusted person. So I had a letter from the Queen saying, I promise you that this man, in very, very long, wordy language, I promise you that this is my representative and I trust him and please help him. Because it was a government-to-government, state-to-state relationship. But it occurred to me increasingly as I was playing that role that actually most days I was actually the representative of Her Majesty's government. It was much more about the government relationship. But really, to do it effectively, I had to be the representative of the people of the UK. And so I thought that when we were most effective as an embassy, it was when we represented that idea of what the UK was about. It was when we owned the wider brand of Premiership football, even Chelsea, of the monarchy, of Prince Harry and Prince William, of David Beckham, all that wider sense of what it is to be British and of British business, and not just the narrow sense of government and states. But that is a much more controversial idea than you'd imagine, and many of my colleagues would take issue with that.
We have mics out there, and we're hoping to have comments or questions or common experiences that you want to share with the group. Wish we could have been seated more in a sort of a round sort of fireside chat environment. But before we go to our friends here, technology can be a great source of positive forces in diplomacy. Yet we see a lot of evil empires that are also growing thanks to technology. I wondered if you had any comments about that, and I saw somewhere that even you claimed that you had been tweeting with terrorists.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah, it is. I think we've talked a bit about the state-to-state issue. The biggest growth areas in my world of diplomacy are the non-state actors, whether they be pirates or terrorists, or in fact, big companies, many of them tech companies. Arguably Google has more influence worldwide than many Security Council members. So that's one big growth area. And the other big growth area is that whole online world where we're actually now battling for our ideas and our values. And so many of my colleagues used to think that the fact that I was on Twitter so much, on Facebook, out on social media, was actually a kind of form of narcissism, sort of diplomatic narcissism. It's kind of, being on social media is kind of showing off because you're saying, here's what I had for breakfast and here's how many followers I have, and attention seeking basically. And I would say it couldn't be further from the truth. This is actually core business because we're taking on these guys where they're making the arguments and where they're recruiting, particularly extremists, where they are actually recruiting potential followers. So I think there is a real battleground out there. And if we're not there, then you leave the space to those bad guys, particularly around extremist ideology and extremist recruitment. So yeah, I was able online to have arguments with people that I couldn't have met offline. I wasn't allowed, for example, to have meetings with Hezbollah, but I could have arguments with Hezbollah online. I wasn't allowed to have meetings with the Syrian regime, but I can tell you they gave me a pretty hard time online anytime I tried to take them on. When I tweet about Syria, I get hit by about 200 Russian-backed robots that tweet back a load of abuse, basically. So they recognize the power of these tools, and so we as diplomats should do as well. Just to close on that, one project we're looking at New York University now is trying to create the opposite of trolls, a benign kind of Twitter or social media army that can be out there doing what diplomats do in real life, trying to make those arguments, trying to calm everyone down, trying to say, let's just take a deep breath and look at the issue from different angles, but to try and deal with this sense of just rage that you get on social media, which is obviously pretty corrosive to our societies.
Did you actually set off, when did this realization occur? Did you actually set off to your posting in Lebanon and say, I'm going to use social media to try and connect with the, into this shift to people diplomacy? Or how did that all happen? And what impact what kind of feedback did you get? Stories of feedbacks. What did it allow you to achieve in terms of successes?
So I definitely didn't set off anticipating being in any way a social media ambassador. And still, for my family, who know that I can barely turn on the television, the idea that I would be giving talks about technology, let alone writing a book about it, they just find utterly baffling. It maybe tells you something about the lack of technological knowledge in my world of diplomacy that I can pretend to be in that position. So when I arrived in Beirut, my instinct was that I wasn't going to be able to have an impact if I was just talking to the same 20 warlords that every other ambassador for the last 40 years had been speaking to. We hadn't made much progress. I felt that I had to find a new way of connecting with with people beyond that, partly because there was this huge fatalism about the country, and people were really giving up on the country, and I felt we had to take on that argument. But I said to the office, it's only worth doing if we do it at real scale. And so I had a brilliant social media advisor who said, in the first 3 months, we have to target getting 100 Twitter followers. And I said, but there are 4 million people in Lebanon. If we're going to do it, we've got to be actually reaching out far beyond just this core group of people who might normally follow ambassadors on Twitter. And so we tried to create campaigns that would go, not as viral as Justin Bieber's hair or a cute kitten, but that in the political world would go viral. And so, for example, you mentioned the job swap with Kalkidan Negusi, who was an Ethiopian housemaid. This was part of, we were trying to run a campaign to get people to confront a very harsh reality in this part of the world, which is that many domestic workers are treated abysmally. And we thought, well, I can make a speech, and maybe 3 people will come, and 2 of them will agree with me already, and 1 will be on their telephone anyway doing something else. Or we can try and find a way to cut through to dinner table conversations. And so we decided that having me become a domestic worker for the morning and clean the bathroom and make the tabbouleh and do those things, of course with cameras there to record that, would shock people. When they saw that on the news, they'd think, oh, His Excellency is cleaning the toilet. So we wanted that to cut through and to make people have arguments. Lots of people hated it. Lots of people thought this was very, very demeaning of my position as an ambassador and of my country. And they thought it was also scratching at a scab that shouldn't be scratched at. But the most effective bit was that in the afternoon, Kalkidan came with me and did my job. So I wasn't just saying that I could do her job, I was showing that she could do my job. And so we had a 21-year-old Ethiopian housemaid speaking with far more power and eloquence than anyone else I know could have done about why people should respect people like her in society. And we went to see the Interior Minister, she gave an interview, and it was that really challenged people. Now, the difficulty is measuring it.
When you say challenged people in your government, or challenged
people in the region.
In the region.
And I know, because so many people have come and told me, hundreds of people have come and told me, particularly younger people, that allowed them to have conversations with their parents at the dinner table they'd never otherwise have had about, well, why is it that our domestic worker doesn't get a day off at the weekend? Why is it that she's not allowed to use Skype to speak to her family? So it's a small way of changing the argument on an issue using social media, but in pursuit of what was a sort of classic diplomatic human rights objective.
Well, I guess it's fair to say this discussion is on the record. It's not off the record, right? So I don't know if there's anybody here who wants to share thoughts or question to Tom Fletcher, who's here with us for a few more minutes.
Okay, hi. Very interesting talk. I guess one thing that occurs to me is that much social media is created by people who, in essence, the people who are designing the technology don't have that many social skills. So how do you reconcile the fact that you're being basically forced into, for want of a better expression, a nerd's world, when effectively a diplomat's a people's person? Do you see that in essence, a diplomat in the future might actually have to be more the sort of person that sits by their computer all the time, or do you think the human element will always be there?
Well, I mean, a lot of diplomats are nerds as well. I think you go where people are, and so if the most important conversations are happening on Twitter and social media, wherever it is, then that's where you should be. I used to tell my perhaps more reluctant colleagues who didn't want to try this out that they should imagine it as being like a massive, great diplomatic reception, and all their contacts were there, exchanging information and arguing and so on. And not being there meant that they were absent from that conversation. Or in some cases worse, they were present but they were just shouting statements across the room. What they should be doing is getting stuck, or they were delegating it to someone else, sending a junior member of staff to be at that reception. But what they should be is in the mix of that reception, exchanging information, pushing, as they would do in a more human environment. In a way, my security profile in Lebanon meant that I was forced to experiment more. Because despite all getting to go to graduation speeches and so on, I was often in a position where I wasn't allowed to move out of my house. Because in addition to my wife, there were lots of other people who wanted to kill me too. Al-Qaeda, at times Hezbollah. You know, I had a complicated security profile. And so social media allowed me to have a conversation that I couldn't have physically.
Thank you. You know, Robert Fisk is based in Lebanon, and he often challenges British policy. So what kind of a relationship did you have with him? How did you deal with him?
So I learned about Lebanon at the feet of writers like Robert Fisk, Tom Friedman, and others who'd written so powerfully about the Civil War. And so I was a huge admirer of his style of journalism and what he'd achieved in that period. I think it's fair to say that, as you touched on, Robert was less of an admirer of British diplomacy and British diplomats in general. And so, despite a couple of efforts, I was sad that we never actually managed to, I never managed to sit with him and tell him what an admirer of his I actually was. His priorities were elsewhere. That was a very on-the-record type response, wasn't it? Sorry, but you get the idea.
What was the trigger point for you to embrace social media the way you did? At what point was there recollection for you that this is something that I need to embrace, that I need to adopt? And was there a challenge that you were experiencing that you felt that social media could help confront?
I think I went through several transitions with social media. The first 6 months or so, I felt it was this fantastic tool for information management, for finding out what was going on in a country. So in the past, a diplomat would write a telegram home saying, I believe that public opinion in Jordan is X, Y, and Z. And you do that on the basis of having been to 2 receptions and read a newspaper article. Suddenly, social media allowed us to reach into this incredible mine of information and find out what people were really talking about on the record. And so that was the initial attraction. Then I suddenly realized that this gave me a means of engaging people in a different way. And so I started actually replying to people's messages. And there was a period of complete shock at that someone, it doesn't seem so strange now, but at the time it was odd that someone in public life would actually reply to messages as authentically as possible, including the people telling me that I was a complete idiot. And there were plenty of those. And they would often, you'd go back and reply and say, well, thank you for your view. Thank you for calling me an idiot, but actually I believe this, and let's have a debate. And you'd find that you would be able to change their minds in that way. So there was that second phase, more of engagement. And then the final phase I tried to get to, but I think this is still work in progress, is actually then using social media to build big and influential campaigns. And so we ran something, for example, called Lebanon 2020, which was meant to be an opportunity for people to talk about why they believed in a vision of Lebanon that perhaps many of the politicians weren't giving them. Some were, but most weren't. That's still work in progress, I think. We haven't yet found a way to really build those big, effective campaigns in the right way. I'm trying to do it now with a big campaign to get 1 million Syrian kids into school. And so I'm trying to reach people who wouldn't otherwise donate time and ideas and in some case money, but more importantly, creativity to helping us get 1 million kids in school. And doing that through social media.
Vinay?
Ambassador, thank you for taking the time to come today. Very generous of you. 2 questions. One, when you talk about the role of technology, it's a very personal experience. So to participate and do this, an engagement, 2-way conversation is very individual. So the first question is, what is the role of an institution in this new world? How does an institution have a 2-way conversation and use this technology to have real conversations and elicit data and determine solutions to problems? And then two, how would you tackle the idea that we have some impediments of large swaths of population, whether it's their access to technology is limited, their ability to afford a phone, or even language impediments that would make it difficult for people like you or myself to communicate in the various languages that people in, especially global growth markets, sort of South markets, that aren't using this technology? How do you engage them as well? Thank you.
Well, thank you first for it's one of the great things about talking to Americans is they still call you ambassador even when you're no longer ambassador. In the British system, that goes straight away. You know, you land at the airport and you're suddenly nothing again. Actually, one of the things I'm doing at the moment is producing a review of British diplomacy for the UK government, and we're trying to answer your question about how do institutions adapt to this slightly terrifying world. You know, and when you come from that world of the Foreign Office, which is a world that understands maps and chaps, clear structures and processes and states and so on, it's quite destabilizing to suddenly be in this kind of this great anarchy. As Alec Ross, who's just written this brilliant book on innovations and the future of work, says, the 21st century is a terrible time to be a control freak. And so institutions like mine are struggling with that. And so I think the theme of that review is that to survive, you have to be much more focused on 21st century skills. And in diplomacy's case, that's things like resilience, courage, creativity, rather than the classic competencies we might have looked at before. You have to be much more focused on using your networks rather than just relying on hierarchies, which means you don't just go and talk to the assistant foreign minister when you want to get something done. You use the graduates from your country, or the business leaders who spent some time in London, or as we did on the One Lebanon initiative, the celebrities, the divas, the singers, the rock stars and so on, to get your message across. You use those networks in a much more effective way. And I think the third thing you've got to do is to focus much less on the inputs, the little piece of analysis that's only read by two people, and much more on the outcomes, the real world effect that you can demonstrate on the ground. For my time in Lebanon, much more important than the social media stuff was the fact that the Lebanese army held the border for those 4 years when Islamic State were trying to get across the Lebanese border. And they did that to a large extent because of really courageous work that our guys were doing with the Lebanese army on the border. That was an outcome and an effect. And actually, even though I've banged on about social media, I'm much prouder of that than of the social media side. Second part was around people who actually aren't in this space. Well, I think the big tech companies are going to help deal with that problem anyway. They're going to get many, many more people online very, very fast. And so the digital divide will seem like less of a divide. In the short term, that is going to present us with some huge, huge challenges. And I think we are just on the very cusp of an age of migration, caused not by a digital divide, but by a wider aspiration divide. And that increasingly people will be able to see that just 2 hours away, there is a very different life available to them, and they'll be more willing to take the risks to go after that more aspirational, more hopeful life. And so as people come online, a lot of people like me are very optimistic about what that will do to entrepreneurship and to the process of creativity and co-creation that you need to innovate. But it will also create some big, big challenges, including the migration that we'll see, but also the empowerment through this kind of raging that you get on social media of people who are going to exploit that politically in our own societies. And we're seeing that in the rise of some of the radical parties in Europe, and we're obviously seeing it in the rise of someone like Donald Trump. And that's frightening.
Do you, we've used the term social media at a very general level. Do you have any thoughts on, there's Facebook, there's Instagram, there's Twitter, and there's more. I mean, were you using different channels for different reasons or different objectives, or was it just really piping the same thing through all the systems?
So I think the message matters much more than the medium. I'd like to think that, if I'd been doing this 100 years ago, I'd have tried to be a really good newspaper columnist. I hope that when radio was invented, there were ambassadors out there trying to use radio to connect with people in new ways. So I wouldn't get too hung up on one part of social media. I was terrified of Facebook, I have to admit, because so many of my friends were on there and I didn't want them circulating photos of what I was doing before I was an ambassador. I felt Twitter felt like a safer space for me, so that was where I ended up spending most of my time. But we did lots of experimenting, Snapchat, Periscope, as new ways of communicating came and went. We tried out different versions. And I'm sure, we'll all be, in 10 years' time, we'll all be on some completely new medium that hasn't been invented yet. And I'm hoping it will have been invented by the Lebanese entrepreneurs at the UK Lebanon Tech Hub that we started, who are busy inventing these new forms of media that we don't yet know exist, but soon we'll find we can't live without.
Do you limit access to your kids on social media, or are you like the coolest dad and they can I
think one of the great things about being a slightly younger ambassador is that your kids are slightly younger, and so they are able to follow you around, telling you the whole time quite how uncool you are. I used to come upstairs, having given a speech in the residence or whatever, and my two boys who are 9 and 4 would shout as I came up the stairs, "Boring ambassador, boring ambassador, boring ambassador." And it means that by the time you get to the top of the stairs, you're pretty deflated again. So they would certainly never think for a second that there was anything remotely cool about what I was doing. They saw social media as a competitor, because they could see I was drawn to it the whole time. It's not something you turn off at 5 o'clock and go home. I think my wife would stress even more that it felt like competition for the family. They're not quite old enough yet, but I am telling them, just be so careful, because everything you do out there will come back to bite you at some stage in the future. I'm so relieved that I was at school and university in a pre-smartphone age. I think most of us are in that position, and thank goodness, because our kids are going to be going to job interviews and having their school photos and their university photos placed in front of them.
Questions, comments, disagreements, agreements, something we haven't raised? There we go. We've got 2 questions, so we'll take 2 at the same time. First Sean, and then over there.
Tom, I think it's great, and I think you're operating probably further down the cutting edge in this particular space in diplomacy than anyone else that I'm aware of. And there are 2 reasons for that, and that's the essence of the challenge that I'm throwing out. Your point about institutional communication is the way in which most institutions have thus far engaged, and the classic rubric, as you know better than I, is public diplomacy. So public diplomacy uses all of these things in order to convey a particular profile, a particular set of messages, with greater or lesser success, and lots of states have engaged in this for 10 years or so, and increasingly are using social media for that purpose. In a certain sense, you are the Benjamin Franklin or the whatever else in the way in which you're describing it, because by the sound of it, you weren't getting directives from the office in respect of what you should be saying or how you should be crafting it and all the rest of it. And therefore, one of the questions that arises is, if you empower individuals in key positions to in fact act in that way, what do you do in respect of the institutional messaging? Is it good or bad that there are then multiple perspectives among multiple audiences within the social media framework of what the United Kingdom is, or the United States is, or the Western powers are, or whatever amalgam seems to be appropriate for the purpose? And then the second bit of it, which sort of tags on to that, is the positive versus negative applications in this regard. I'm sure you know Farah Pandith, who's now up at Harvard writing a book that she couldn't write while she was doing the interesting things that she was doing in state. But her job, for want of a better phrase, was CVE, countering violent extremism in a significant way, leveraging the living daylights, among other things, out of social media for that purpose. And she, I think has come away, the book isn't out, but this is what she says in private conversations, and I don't think she said it in public as well, that the resources deployed for this purpose are completely inadequate and frankly rather clunky, bearing in mind the nature of the competitive landscape. Now, it seems to me that if that is happening at the institutional level, and this is the negative messaging as opposed to the creative messaging that you were speaking of, it must be even more difficult at the individual level to be able to determine what it is that one should be doing, both positively and negatively. And then to close all of that, the sort of key question is most people have taken the view in the context of the Arab Spring onward that social media are a brilliant means of exacerbating the ability to organize for the purposes of social disruption, but not a good way of creating institutions, leaders, or that which follows after the disruption has taken place.
Yeah.
Based on what you've experienced, what's your take on that one?
Yeah, very interesting set of ideas. One thing I'm writing about at the moment is the fact that it's not all about this brave new shiny world and a bunch of diplomats charging around, tweeting and so on. That's the tip of the iceberg, but there's still a big iceberg to diplomacy, which is about the things we've been doing since my prehistoric man, trying to find different ways to get countries and ideas and to rub along with the sort of lubricant in the system. And so there's still a need to do a huge amount of that peacekeeping and negotiation work. The kind of classic diplomacy. There's still a need to do a whole amount of stuff in secret. Although it would be harder and harder to justify doing that in this age of much greater transparency and also in an age of mistrust. It'll be harder for us to win the confidence of the population that we should be allowed to, for example, manage all their data in order to look for where the terrorism is going on, to search for the needle in the haystack. People are going to say, well, what gives you that right? We don't trust you anymore to do that. I used to always say to the skeptical ambassadors and others who were very, very worried about the risks out there, and there are risks of being on social media, that the biggest risk is not to be on it at all. And so I was quite happy to run some of those risks. In the early days, it was much easier because, as you said, no one in the centre knew what we were doing. Now and again, one of my tweets would turn up on the news, and then you'd know about it. Someone would be on the phone pretty quickly, and there were a couple of early day experimental tweets that I had to take down pretty swiftly once the Prime Minister saw them. But those were, those were the kind of early days in that terrain. I think the key is that it comes back to the point I made, Alex's point about not being too control freaky in this space. I think the institution, the government, has to set the broad campaign messages. So in our case, the message was that Foreign Office is here to promote British prosperity, British security, and British values. Those are the big messages. And then leave it then to the more operational, tactical person on the ground to work out how to interpret those messages in the right way for these different audiences. But you still have to have some element of structure and control around it. Now, I'm always at the anarchic end of that, but I'll give you an example from next year, or the coming year or so. We're going through a number of big anniversaries in the Middle East, around Britain's role in the Middle East. And I'd rather not go into a great debate about Sykes-Picot and Balfour, but it's a debate that I had at every one of those 52 universities that Fred mentioned. And so my colleague in Tel Aviv might be wanting to tweet in quite a different way about the Balfour Declaration to my colleague in Jerusalem. It's two very different audiences there, the Palestinian audience and the Israeli audience. And so we have to think very carefully about that and make sure that we're not all just shooting off in different directions. On the resource available, the Foreign Office has less digital resource than the Shetland Islands. So there is a challenge, and I think there's a trend towards putting more and more resource into digital work. But we also have to remember that for most people out there, putting something governmental on social media is immediately a turn-off. It's very difficult to tweet from a government account in an engaging, authentic way. People are much more likely to follow your individual handle than the government one. And so you have to be a bit careful that we don't end up, by wading in as an institution or as a government, suddenly make the whole thing so uncool that everyone then goes off and has a conversation somewhere else. I think probably when you've got more than half the ambassadors on one form of media, that's a sign that you should probably go somewhere else and discover a new one, but I would say that.
Yes, please.
Hi, I think you've answered some of my questions already, but one of the things I was wondering, particularly your perspective as a former ambassador in the region, is this idea of accountability, because we often talk about social media as being these democratic tools, when in fact they're entirely opposite to that. There's nothing democratic about them. They're owned entirely by corporations in particular parts of the world that are prone to government pressures. And we're in a region where we're seeing, journalists and activists and revolutionaries who are being detained for having a particular political perspective. But this is not just happening here. This is happening worldwide. In the UK and the US, whistleblowers, are being sought after. So I'm curious, as a government employee, I mean, what your perspective and where is that in the conversation, and how can we talk about social media without talking about that? And in fact, there is this very negative dark side to the ways in which social media is being utilized that often seem to be completely missing from the conversation.
Well, I can talk maybe as a former government person. I'm not currently a government person. I think it's a very important point, but I think that governments certainly don't feel they have much control over this space. I certainly never did. And if you look at, I think actually governments would often regard some of the big tech companies as competition in the space for influence. You look at some of the battles at the moment in the US with some of the big tech companies over who can have access to what data. So I think it's a very contested space. I would back citizens, people at large, to continue to find ways around governments. Government will always want to put its hand onto any means people have of communicating, and it won't necessarily be for completely evil reasons, but it's a natural tendency of government to want to establish more control. But what I hear from entrepreneurs and activists in this space is that if you build a wall around the internet, we'll just build an internet around your wall. And so every effort there is to constrain dialogue tends to be circumvented. Someone comes up with a new means to get round governments. And I think overall that's a good thing, but coming back to Sean's question, it also makes a lot of foreign policy quite a lot harder, especially for more open-minded, tolerant countries, or those of us who claim to be more open-minded and tolerant. We can argue about that. So I'll give you an example for me in my recent experience with Syria. August 2013, the foreign policy establishment, and in fact the government, were arguing that we should take military action in Syria because of Assad's use of chemical weapons, which Obama had said was a red line. But we suddenly realized that actually our public had a different view. Now, 100 years ago, that wouldn't have mattered. 50 years ago, it probably wouldn't have mattered. You could argue that on Iraq, it didn't matter in the end. But in this case, because of that democratization of policymaking, because people are more empowered through social media and other means, they were able to prevent military action taking place. And there was a very clear vote in the House of Parliament that meant that the UK wasn't part of that military action, and that then gave the American system pause for thought as well. So in that case, our democratization, our transparency, all of which are fantastic things, made it harder for us to exercise our foreign policy in the way that we wanted to. It made it harder for us to play poker with Putin over Syria, because he could see our cards.
You satisfied with that?
We're going to argue afterwards, aren't we?
Okay. Bishar?
Is your successor in Beirut as digitally active as you were?
I think he is, yes. Everyone will do this differently. And the important thing is it's authentic. And so with many of our ambassadors, I often say to them, don't do social, it's worse to do it badly than not to do it at all, actually. So unless you're really excited about it, then don't. in his case, luckily, we have someone who's really up for it and is very keen to engage. My predecessor as well, she was one of the first ambassadors to blog on quite a large scale. So there's maybe something in the air of Beirut that encourages people to be a bit more risk-taking.
Okay, because the main question was, if you set the bar so high for a community and interact with them, with those groups, with the groups that you want to push your messages to, you know, on and on and on, and suddenly your successor is not that active, doesn't that give a perception about that the British government is not consistent? You know, when you set the standard and your successor doesn't necessarily as active as you are, doesn't that disappoint the people that you've been engaging with for the last 5 years on those main topics?
Well, in this case, that won't happen because he is active and kind of very, very well regarded around the place. But I do think there's a broader point here that, in a way, you've let the genie out of the bottle. Once you start to say, actually, ambassadors are no longer behind the wall. We are no longer just talking to each other and staying clear of life out there. Once you basically open yourself up in that way, it's quite hard to close it up again. But I just think this is the 21st century. I think it's a reality, and increasingly ambassadors, but also business leaders, politicians, will either be digital or dead. And those who aren't engaging will just find that they don't survive. It's Darwinian. You know, when horseback riding came along, we learned how to ride horses. When the telephone came along, we learned how to use the telephone for diplomacy. When the printing press was invented, we learned how to use the spread of languages and writing to enhance diplomacy, and this is no different.
We're going to go to the last question, but I guess this might be difficult for you to say, but maybe your successor, the institution remains, but to your point earlier, it's the individual, it's Tom Fletcher that is missed, but maybe not so much the institution itself that you represent.
I hope that I was able to connect with people in Lebanon because I brought some sort of authenticity and individual personality to it. I think that makes it, for better or worse, people then can see what you're like. And they either hate it or they like it. But you open up that conversation. But I think everyone there knew I was doing it as the British ambassador. And so I was tweeting from, my account was HMA, Her Majesty's Ambassador Tom Fletcher. It wasn't just T Fletcher 1572. And I hope that even if I was occasionally tweeting about how much I hate Chelsea, that people could stack up whatever it is, those 10,000 tweets, and they add up to a narrative about Britain in the Middle East. They add up to something, to a wider message about the UK government's effort to engage people across the region. And I think you can take the individual out of that, and the message is still there.
Okay, I've got Shireen telling me we've got to stop, but can you be brief with your question and maybe give a brief answer, and then we'll break for lunch?
Yes, it's a very short question. When you realize that you have tweeted the wrong thing, how fast can you erase it?
So my wife set a rule that I wasn't allowed to tweet after 2 glasses of wine, which was a very effective rule. I would also often put something in the drafts folder for 15 minutes, especially if I was kind of slightly angry about something a politician had said, for example. Because sometimes after 15 minutes, you realize that you were trying to be a bit too clever or a bit too provocative. The great thing about Twitter is picking arguments. I love having arguments on there. And I had arguments with the Iranian regime, but I also then tweeted a picture of myself donating blood outside the Iranian embassy when it was blown up. Because we didn't have diplomatic relations at the time. And it was my way of showing solidarity through social media in a way I couldn't have done otherwise. But yeah, I've deleted 2 tweets, and both of which I'm glad I took down. But again, I come back to this point that we'll all make mistakes, but the biggest mistake is not to be out there engaging with people in what is hopefully an authentic and effective and influential way.
So, Tom, when is your book coming out?
Ah, good. Yes, I should have mentioned the book much
I'm
more.
surprised you didn't. I mean, I have to remind you.
Thank you so much. Look, I'll give you your commission later. So the book is out on June the 2nd and is called Naked Diplomacy, and it's about many of these themes. It's about how power and statecraft are changing in a digital age and how we'll have a much more empowered debate about foreign policy in the future. It's about, we didn't get onto it, but Assange and Snowden and how they've changed this debate too. Please do buy a copy before it's reduced to 99p in the bargain bucket.
So, Tom, thank you so much for having been with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. What a great way to end the Abraj Week here today. It's been a series of discussions of different kinds that we've been holding here. It's the first time we do this year to such an extent. So we'd love to have you back next year.
Yes, thank you.
And we can sell copies of your book to those who won't have bought it.
There'll be some rare unsigned copies available.
Right. I'm asked to remind everybody that at 3 o'clock there's a curated tour of the art fair for those of you who would like to join. We have some lunch that is ready to be served. Barry, our pianist, will be with us from 4 to 6:30 this evening. And then the 2016 Art Dubai Fair closes for this year. So thanks to all of you who've been with us this week, and enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Thank you very much.